Greetings, parish orphans and retrogrades. Happy Monday. Such a thing exists. It's a Rules for Retrogrades Monday. And as always, here on Rules for Retrogrades, we are blending in our analysis the culture of the world, more like bending the culture of the world, to the one true culture, the culture of the church. In our show topic today, which is, should the U.S. have exclusively Christian leaders? People have been asking for a little bit more general election coverage in 2024. If you've noticed, no one cares because it's all basically fake. It's all basically ancillary to the real pursuits of amending Western civilization, which is to say amending Christendom, which is to say amending, reconciling, rectifying Roman Catholicism. But there is a Catholic answer to the question about the leaders in Western civilization and what sort we ought to expect and look to. And so the question dealt with recently on a very, very famous Twitter Spaces by a fellow Catholic. I think it happened yesterday. Should the U.S. have only Catholic leaders, or at least only Christian leaders? The answer here is an obvious one. It's of course. Of course it should. Of course they should only be Christian leaders. It's a Christian country now. This is an of course. And the of course is because of the ruling cultural and political philosophy of the church, which I call pre-liberalism. Just the Roman Catholic teaching on politics and political culture, political economy, pre-liberalism. Most people that are rooting for or against a certain answer here, should the U.S. have a certain leader, are rooting for or against yes or no because of the wrong reason. The correct answer is yes, obviously. Because of true Catholicism, it's called pre-liberalism, the true political economy. Yes, the U.S. should have only Christian leaders, should have only Catholic leaders. But because of a false worldview known as post-liberalism, which has arisen in the last 10 years, and I've debated two of the leading post-liberals, a lot of folks are thinking and rooting and cheering and saying and expressing yes, which is ultimately the correct answer, but for the wrong reason. Yes, the U.S. should have a Christian leader, but for the wrong reason. And because of a competing false worldview, political ideology, political economy, known as classical liberalism, a lot of folks are saying, well, no, of course not. And this is ultimately the wrong answer. And they have the wrong answer for many of the wrong reasons. Obviously, if you have the wrong answer, you have to have it for some of the wrong reasons. But some of these guys, the cheerleaders of classical liberalism, do have some correct premises, but they have enough wrong premises, propositionally speaking, to come up with the wrong answer to the syllogism, the wrong conclusion. So the answer is yes, of course. The U.S. should have only Christian leaders. It should have only Catholic leaders. If we're asking what ought to happen according to the natural law. But the people that said yes correctly did so almost in every case. The folks that say, yeah, of course, they're saying so for the wrong reason, post-liberalism. And the folks that said no, of course, were saying no from a classical liberal perspective, which is wrong as well. The true answer, meaning you have the right premises and the right conclusion, is the true political culture of Catholic pre-liberalism. I'll explain what Catholic pre-liberalism is in this show today. And it's an important one. Important because, yeah, I guess there's this upcoming election. It's a general election year. I don't even think a lot of baby boomers or Gen X, greatest gen who are surviving care about it much because of what happened in 2020. It's political hokum. And politics is fake and Skittles. We don't care. What needs to happen is a cultural politics, a political culture, a political economy that is pre-liberal. This does not make post-liberalism correct. It doesn't mean I'm advocating for classical liberalism. So I've had unpleasant run-ins with famous post-liberal Sohrab Ahmari of New York Post fame. On several occasions, I think he eventually blocked me, or I blocked him. He's a Catholic convert from Iran, or his father's from Iran. I think he came here when he was young. He used to be a Marxist. Then he started claiming to be right-wing. Then he became Catholic, and then he started cheering for China. And he recently condemned all racism roundly on the right wing, as if that's just like a really pressing issue. So he's on all sides of many of these issues, and he doesn't have a really competent, holistic, comprehensive political philosophy. And he's been all over the place. That's Sohrab Ahmari. I've never debated him, though. But Josh Hammer is another post-liberal who's confused. I debated him on the 14th Amendment at Ole Miss in person. That was a good one. Patrick Deneen, I've debated on the internet, on an internet debate 5 years ago. He's at Notre Dame. All of these, aside from Josh Hammer, are Catholic. Josh Hammer's, I believe, Jewish. There's also famous ones like Gladden Papin, University of Dallas professor. He's another post-liberal. There's Adrian Vermeule, allegedly Catholic, Harvard law prof. There's Michael Hanby and some of his devotees out of the Steubenville area. And there are lots of post-liberals who are people, generally speaking, that have made a cottage industry about condemning what they call old liberalism. They never define what old liberalism is, and they mean classical liberalism. They basically say anything other than their narrow, big government, anti-Catholic teaching of subsidiarity view, local government view of political culture. Anything that opposes their view is classical liberalism. That's the game with the post-liberals. That is literally, if you pull up a Sohrab tweet right now or an Adrian Vermeule tweet, he's got like half of the internet blocked, Vermeule. Amari's not as quick to block. Or Pat Deneen or Hanby or Gladden Papin, who's like staying in Hungary or was on sabbatical there for a while. That's what they do. They say that if you do not share their basically FDR, socialist, big geographic regime, big government, interventionist view of politics, that you're a classical liberal. And they're really loud on the internet, and no one besides, like, oh my gosh, David French is really willing to defend classical liberalism. I'm not saying that they should be willing to defend classical liberalism, because it's a Protestant/Enlightenment perspective. And I describe this really, 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 really well, if I do say so myself, in my first book, Catholic Republic. Classical liberalism is what I call Prot-Enlight, a mashup of the 16th century's religious right, Protestantism, which is a liberal Christian theology, but it's kind of considered the font of the religious right, mashed up with the grandparentage of what today we call the secular left, Enlightenment philosophy, particularly empiricist Enlightenment philosophy. And some of the empiricists are most expressly associated with classical liberalism. You know one empiricist better than others, John Locke. There's also David Hume, who corresponded with some of the American framers and founders. And it's all vaguely sort of liberal Christian theology, Protestantism mixed up with Enlightenment thought, which is happening at late 16th, early 17th century. So classical liberalism is some mishmash of wrong ontology, metaphysics, and Christian theology that's upstream of what we've embraced as kind of limited government. And by we, I just mean most Americans who aren't Marxists and who aren't post-liberals. And the upstreamness of the wrong Protestant classical liberal ontology, metaphysics, and theology should not deliver a small government point of view, but they particularly John Locke just lifted the correct sort of, you know, pro-liberty, pro-property downstream trappings of the correct natural law ontology and natural law metaphysics from Catholicism, even though they rejected that. So it's made for this really complex situation whereby nowadays, in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 years, the post-liberals, most of whom are Catholic, just say, hey, we like this essentially Stalinist political economy. We like essentially globalism or hemispherialism or continentalism. I'm going to explain why this is wrong today. Basically a Stalinist political economy, have a sweeping landmass like Soviet Russia or China. That's really good, even though Catholicism condemns this. And we're going to make fun of the fact that classical liberalism has its roots in the 16th and 17th century, what I call Protestant light. So they're part right and part wrong. Classical liberalism has the correct small scope of government, but is part right and part wrong. And I'm going to explain which part's right and which part's wrong, and why ultimately, yes, from a non-post-liberal perspective, from a pre-liberal perspective, U.S. should have only Christian leaders. And this doesn't require big government conservatism to say so. That's today's show. It's a big project, and it's one of the big pillars of this show, subsidiarity. This show has 4 pillars from show to show. It's all either patriarchy, pillar 1, subsidiarity, pillar 2, right-wing community organizing, pillar 3, or re-education, pillar 4, if we're not doing a news show on Pope Francis saying some new 2,000-year-old irreformable doctrine is now defunct. We have to cover Francis still, but I try to do as few Francis shows as I can get away with. Now, because it's an election year, you need to get out of your blue state and get to a red state more than ever. You always need to get out of your blue state and get to a red state, because of the argument that we're going to make today. Because you need to live surrounded by folks who share a res publica, which is Christianity. Hopefully they share Roman Catholic Christianity with you. That's what it is to believe in the Catholic worldview. It means you should live around people who agree with you. You should not accept this false view of pluralism. This is the closest thing to true liberalism. And if you reject pluralism, then you will get out of your blue state and get to a red state today. It is not the Catholic thing to live in a place like California and New York and say, I'm going to evangelize. You're not evangelizing. You're not doing jack squat. You're just staying there because you were raised there and you want to be there. You need to get to a place that's truly red, where most of the people, most of your neighbors will be Protestants. Let's be honest. Here in Mississippi, the reddest of all 50 states, most of my neighbors are Baptist. If they're not Baptist, they're Methodist. And this is the kind of place where you can actually evangelize. You can't evangelize New York or California. I tried. And people that stay aren't staying and fighting anyway. They're just staying and wallowing. Go to www.realestateforlife.org today, and a pro-life Catholic will help you get out of your blue state and get to a red state today. It's especially important in an election year because they're going to do something that will lead to closing state borders and not allowing you to leave. Steph and I were just looking at the numbers, how many net people have left California over the last 9 years, and it's increasing. Sooner or later, they're going to stop this from being allowed.
They're going to tax it.
There's rumors of taxation, but remember what happened in late 2019, early 2020. They will actually take executive steps at the gubernatorial or even the presidential level to disallow state transference, state comity. Get out now while you can. Get out while it's a little bit of a buyer's market. realestateforlife.org. Like this video, subscribe, click the notification bell. If you want to support me, please consider doing it on Patreon. Not on Patreon, I got kicked off there. On Locals or Subscribe-Star. For Locals and Subscribe-Star patrons today, you get access to a complete chapter-by-chapter synopsis, set of classes, one class per chapter on Fellowship of the Ring. We're in the middle now, beginning middle of the Two Towers. You'll have that, so you'll have to kind of get caught up. They're pre-recorded, but they're also live. They're live, but they're recorded, so you can catch up. And we're going all the way through Return of the King. So by the end, what will be available for patrons on Locals and Subscribe-Star will be a complete chapter. Every chapter will have one class of discussion that was originally live between me and my friend, expert on LOTR, Anthony. Every chapter of the trilogy giving the thoroughly Catholic analysis to what trad Catholic Tolkien was trying to do. That's a long trilogy. It's the greatest trilogy of all time, the greatest set of books written in the 20th century. That will be available to patrons only. Okay. So, should America have only Christian leaders? Obviously. Obviously. Only David French calls himself right-wing and says no. It's a Christian country. Hear me out, folks. If America ran the way it was supposed to, we should have 99% only Christians in the populace. Now, I was having a discussion with my friend George Farmer behind the scenes on, okay, what is the deal? Post-liberalism, classical liberalism, which one's right, which one's wrong, as it relates to this question. How Christian should the leaders and the followers be in the public space? I say all the way Christian. And it came to a point in the discussion where, I don't just mean with George, very, very brilliant guy, but with anyone, where they go, oh, so does that make you a post-liberal? Because the post-liberals say, if you answer yes, you have to be one of us. No, not at all. Oh, so are you a classical liberal then? Of course not. I am a pre-liberal. And this is not a parlor trick. I'll show you what I mean. Liberalism, which will never really aptly get defined by either party here, post-liberals, classical liberals, has one meaning. It means pluralism, continentalism. I'll explain what this means. Liberalism means a pluralistic society that is necessarily pluralistic because it's so geographically expansive. Neither side in the modern discourse wants, and I mean neither side, the post-liberals nor the classical liberals, wants to dispense with the pluralistic continentalism, the continental pluralism. That's probably the better expression. Let's call it continental pluralism. So this isn't just some Parler trick where I'm using a distinction within a word or a name to express that I believe both sides are part wrong and part right. There's a major presupposition shared by both the post-libs and the classical libs that is absolutely un-Catholic, anti-Catholic, and wrong. And it's the view of continental pluralism. Now, why I'm calling it continental pluralism is because if you ask any of these guys, post-libs or classical libs, hey, do you believe in globalism? One world government, new world order? They'll say, no, that's crazy. One government for all the world? That's out of Revelation. That's the Antichrist stuff, and I agree. Government that large violates the natural law. Government that large violates Catholic teaching in a document called Quadragesimo Anno. The principle it violates that is called by Pius XI in Quadragesimo Anno subsidiarity. It is a natural law precept being violated. We'll talk about how later. So the government can never be so large as to cover a ground so expansive as all the world. But what about, I said this with Seamus Coughlin, I think on his show once. So, okay. Then you ask the post-libs in particular, what about hemispherialism? Can there be two world governments? One for Western Hemisphere and one for Eastern Hemisphere? How about one for the Northern Hemisphere, one government for the Southern Hemisphere? And most people are shrewd enough to say, well, no, that's basically just as bad. That's basically just as bad. We'll talk about why when we talk about subsidiarity and Pius XI in a second. But first, I want to talk about its corollary, continentalism's corollary, pluralism. Folks, particularly the post-libs, are shrewd enough to acknowledge that if your republic or your kingdom, whatever you call it, or your aristocracy, the third good regime, is a continent sized, meaning basically a quarter, a third of a hemisphere, still too big, right? Say it's a third of a hemisphere is one continent if we average it out. Disregard Antarctica. Each hemisphere has 3 continents. That's still too large. That still, according to Pius XI, violates a natural law precept, meaning it's an all the time evil to have government or a landmass that is one nation, one republic, one kingdom that large. It's a malum in se, an evil in itself. If your government's that large, that means that there aren't only 6 types of people in the world. And that means that continentalism requires pluralism. Continentalism requires pluralism. Pluralism is the heart of liberalism. It means that within one res publica, republic, you don't share a res publica. It means a republic that lacks a res publica. A republic that is not a republic, actually. Now, say this one more time with me. Pluralism is the true form of liberalism because it entails people living amongst each other who do not share a res publica, but calling their collective political economy a res publica, a republic anyway. Do you understand? In order for you to live in a true republic or a true monarchy, a true kingdom, a true aristocracy, it has to be a small enough grouping of people such as to reject pluralism. Now, neither the post-libs nor the classical libs wanted to do this. The only worldview, the only political culture that ever embraced keeping republics small enough so that there actually still remain republics was the Catholic teaching, the Aristotelian teaching. An even lapsed Catholic, the Baron de Montesquieu, was talking about this. He was a lapsed Catholic, but he had 20 years of Catholic education, and he was sort of a historian of republics. So he said, look, Aristotle said there are three good regimes. Republics are one of them, but monarchies and aristocracies, the other two good regimes, also have to be small. They have to be small. Aristotle said, I forget if it's 50,000 or 100,000 is too large to be a true anti-pluralist, true res publica, where you share, or when I say res publica, I mean you share a common religion. That's what Aristotle meant. When you share a common religion, then all of a sudden you can live with one another without expecting moral decay every time the legislature meets. Should we make a bill forcing, women to go into the men's bathroom? We talk this way because we live in a liberal pluralist society. And because, for reasons I don't want to get into today, we're always accommodating the lowest common denominator. That's the elites pushing that. That's why we talk that way. That's why you assume that. But Aristotle said 50 or 100,000 is too large to share a res publica, whether you're talking any of the three good regimes. A republic has res publica in its name, but this goes for monarchies and aristocracies too. They should be small. If you want to keep your nerds comic book club up in a treehouse really pure, if you want to keep the membership really pure, you have to keep it small. If you want to keep the club small, then you'll keep it really pure. See how this works? Over here. Okay. So pluralism is the true liberalism. Pluralism is the true liberalism. And it's been condemned by Pius IX, by Leo XIII, by Pius XI. It's been condemned by all of them. Okay. We will discuss how this gets skipped by post-liberals. Post-liberals are the ones that say, well, classical liberalism is wrong because it's essentially a 16th, 17th century rejection of Catholicism. Classical liberalism was, in fact, a rejection of, by Protestants and Enlightenment thinkers, of Catholic metaphysics, ontology, theology. Metaphysics, ontology, theology. And all I mean by that is the Catholic metaphysics, thank you, that's better. The Catholic metaphysics is one of Aristotelian hylomorphism. Now, John Locke, who was both a Protestant and an Enlightenment thinker and an empiricist, which is why he's the best mashup for what is early classical liberalism, what is Protestant light. He was both. John Locke rejected Aristotelian hylomorphism. There's another thinker, Francis Bacon. There's another one, David Hume. They're all early empiricists who are all a mashup of Protestantism and Enlightenmentism. And they all said Aristotle has to go because we don't believe in the matter-form composite nature of the universe. That's the Catholic metaphysics. Francis Bacon had a text called the Novum Organum. Or Organon was Aristotle's text about metaphysics, physics mashup with biology. And so Bacon and the empiricists, the early classical liberals, they said, we need to do away with Aristotle. We need to absolutely kill him. Martin Luther said he's the buffoon who ruined Christianity. All of these guys hated Aristotle. More than the Catholic Church, they hated pre-Catholic Aristotle because Aristotle is the philosopher of the Catholic Church. Before Thomas, it was Aristotle because he represented an ontology, metaphysics, and set up for the Catholic theology of composite hylomorphism, meaning matter and form. So Locke rejected this. Locke was actually a corpuscularian. He was like an alchemist. He believed in magic atoms. He believed that there's no such thing as substance and accidents, that atoms account for sometimes having a property that we would consider accidental. He did not believe in hylomorphism. He did not believe in the natural law, John Locke. You can't believe in the natural law if you're an empiricist. An empiricist says there's no such thing as immaterial principles, like even the principle of causation or the principle of contradiction. They reject the natural law. The natural law is inherently hylomorphic. John Locke rejected it, but we know him in the second treatise as like the articulator of the natural law as received by Jefferson et al. At the founding of this country. So the post-liberals just point at that funny foible of intellectual history being the fact that the classical liberals are rejectors of Aristotelianism and Catholicism, but that the classical liberals did articulate something similar to the principles of Catholic small government. And the post-liberals just ride that symbol. They just ride it. Boom, 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 boom. The classical liberals are Lockean rejectors of all things Catholic. And so they slip into the premises the idea that, therefore, what's known as small government must be wrong as well. And it's not. The post-liberals are liberal. Insofar as, if you go to any of them, I'm not talking just Sohrab Ahmari, not just Vermeulen, not just Deneen, not Gladden Papin, who likes Hungary. Any of them, all post-liberals love pluralism. They say, well, we have to live with pluralism. Why? Because they love continentalism. They hate Catholic subsidiarity. Whereas the classical liberals are at least in theory a little bit hipper to subsidiarity and small government principles. They have the wrong metaphysics and ontology and theology that does not actually furnish, on the bottom line, the small government, the Catholic small government principles they claim to embrace. We'll talk about them in a second. But let's talk about what subsidiarity is. Now, according to Pius XI, who coined the term 40 years after Rerum Novarum in an encyclical celebrating 1891's Pope Leo XIII's Rerum Novarum, where the principles of subsidiarity are laid out. Well, 40 years later, Pius XI gives it a name. He says subsidiarity means that it's always a grave evil. It's a grave evil, a mortal sin, for a more distant authority to occupy a legislative field that's generically capable of being occupied by a more local authority. Now, what really is at root here in subsidiarity is patriarchy. We live, according to Benedict XVI, in the age of absconding fathers. He said that right before he absconded. And of course, that means we're in trouble. If subsidiarity requires patriarchy, having a really good household father, most people are screwed. Because most fathers have sort of abandoned their post in the last 100 years. Yeah, that's true. That's another matter, though. That's another matter altogether. Well, what if the father absconds? What if your neighbor's father absconds, but you have a really good father? He has a deficient one. He has Pap Finn. You have a great father. Well, according to what Pius XI and Leo XIII said 40 years apart about this grave moral error, this mortal sin of violations of subsidiarity, is that generically, meaning at the level of genus, You only gauge whether or not a legislative power should move from the more local authority, the father, to the less local authority, the city, state, or national government, based on generically whether or not that legislative field is capable of being occupied at the more local level. What that means is that if you're comparing your father to your neighbor's deficient, derelict, Pap Finn father, and you say, oh, well, his dad's gone, doesn't that mean that then we have to legislate the morality at the global or at least the national level, the continental pluralist level? Shouldn't we make 32 ounces of cola illegal like they did in New York because his dad is Pap Finn? Well, no, because generically, meaning judging by the genus, not by the species, generically, you have a good father. Your father tells you don't drink 32 ounces of cola at once. I mean, it's not straightforwardly immoral, but you're going to get kidney stones, son. Whatever, use the sexier, more important moral examples. Generically, you proved the case that, yeah, just because Pap Finn isn't guarding his son, and because a lot of fathers out there today are Pap Finns, it doesn't mean that legislative power slips to the more far off, the vaster legislative space, according to Catholic teaching. Now, I'm just going according to Catholic teaching. You got to go read Quadragesimo Anno, the 1931 encyclical that represents 2,000 years of really governmental teaching, representing even Aquinas about halfway from Jesus to the 20th century. Aquinas says not all vice should be proscribed, not all virtue should be mandated, following on Aristotle. Aristotle has a doctrine called concord that is very, very similar to what we're going to call solidarity. Sorabamari will always push back on subsidiarity with a concept called solidarity. I'm going to read for you a quote from Centesimo Anno, Pope John Paul II, celebrating Rerum Novarum 100 years afterwards, in 1991. Remember, Quadragesimo Anno, 40 years later, took place in 1931, 40 years after Rerum Novarum. Well, Rerum Novarum is really, really important. That's what we're learning here. That's what we know, judging by the facts. Subsidiarity is hated by the post-liberals. And I remember one tweet by a particular post-liberal, Sohrab Ahmari, where he said, these guys just, all these classical libs talk about is subsidiarity. Well, no, actually the classical libs are not Catholic. You can't be a Catholic and a classical liberal, because a classical liberal is Protestant Enlightenment in his view of the world. He's Lockean. He doesn't have a hylomorphic ontology. Doesn't have the metaphysics consonant with a hylomorphic ontology. Can't be Catholic. But hylomorphism also tells us that conscience is sovereign. Aristotelian virtue ethics, I think it's book 4 of the Nicomachean Ethics, which has been essentially baptized by the Catholic Church, tells us that it's only an accidental virtue if you perform a virtue as it is compelled. For a virtuous act to be truly virtuous, for it to grow from your intellect into your will, into your character, you have to freely choose it. This is the main reason why, anthropologically, it is wrong to, from a far-off government, legislate morality. Now, it's not wrong from a nearby government, especially your father, because that government trains the virtue, even though it's initially compelled with a 3-year-old. By the time you get to a 6 or 7-year-old, you're training the virtue into their will and intellect. Far-off government's not capable of doing that. Far-off government is only capable of laying out the law, and even if you comply with the law, you're never building the virtue itself. That's why it's a violation of natural law. And Aristotle's very clear about this in books 3 and 4 and book 2 of the Nicomachean Ethics. Aquinas says in his commentary on Aristotle and in the Summa that not all vice should be proscribed, not all virtue should be required by the state, using this Aristotelian rationale, because then the people will never get downstream of it. But it should be compelled to a 3-4-year-old by a loving father, or even like a local government. Like if you have a city that's the size of your neighborhood and another authority figure helps to point it out, they can give the moral lesson rather than just the moral dictate. It's a natural law principle that as you give a law, you have to teach. A government from Honolulu, Hawaii to Washington, D.C., the nerve center of our LGBTQ Leviathan, globalist, continentalist, pluralist, liberal government now, 5,000 miles away, is not capable of moral instruction. It violates the natural law. Is a referee on the opposite end of the basketball court capable of making the call if you step on the line or you're very close to stepping out of bounds? No. Only the ref who's very, very near can make the call. Can, if you have small children, you want to take your wife out for a date, are you capable of just phoning in from 10 miles away and checking on let's say your oldest child is 6, you have a 6-year-old, a 4-year-old, a 2-year-old. You just phone in once every half hour and still govern properly? No. Governance you have to hire a stand-in for you, a babysitter, who's there in the position to make the call. This is a natural law proposition. It's not merely an ideal. Remember what the subverters of Roman Catholic perfect moral teaching always do. They characterize the teaching as merely an ideal if they want to subvert it. Subsidiarity is violations of it anyway. Let's take it that way. Violations of subsidiarity are grave evils, grave infractions, mortal sins every time they happen, because they are disabling folks from being able to grow in virtue. Think of my referee or my babysitter example. That's why Roman Catholicism rejects not only far-off government, but vast geographic areas. Vast geographic areas, big republics, geographically large monarchies or aristocracies will require big government. Now you're getting at the heart of the teaching. For 2,500 years, the Republican theorists from Aristotle to Seneca, Cicero, Augustine, some of the other Neoplatonists besides, Bonaventure, Aquinas, then you get to the Salamancans, you take Bellarmine, Suarez, Juan de Mariana, another Catholic Jesuit back when Catholic Jesuits were based, all the way through Montesquieu, a kind of lapsed Catholic, educated at Julili, but classical education. They all knew that in order for a place to be truly Christian, to have truly Christian governance or abidance, it had to be small. Now, the post-liberals hate this because they like big government. It's that simple. They point out rightly the flaws with classical liberals. The classical liberals have a non-anti-Christian Lockean corpuscularianism ontologically and metaphysically. But they just like big government. They'll admit it. We just like big government. What about the classical liberals? Well, if you want to read the best expression of classical liberals selling out subsidiarity, even though they don't like Roman Catholicism, but they're depicted as liking small government, go read the most famous of the Federalist Papers, Federalist number 10. Actually, you can read 10 or 39 or 51. All three of those are rejections of the fundamental defining elements of the Catholic teaching, subsidiarity. All three of those. Number 10, and they're all James Madison, being a classical liberal, saying, faction, he means pluralism here. What's the biggest problem in a big government? Faction, pluralism. What's the solution to faction? What does he say? What's the answer in Federalist 10? A lot of people learn this in middle school. He says it's more faction. This is classical liberalism. Actually, this is also post-liberalism. Both parties here embrace this fallacy of Federalist number 10. Now, let me give you a little historical background on why James Madison, writing as Publius in the Federalist, in numbers 10 and 39 and 51, gives you the fallacious answer about faction. Now, I don't mean they're all Catholics, but I mean the true Catholic political culture in early America that was so loved by Leo XIII. He said, you guys did so much, early America did so much for the cause of religion, even though they're mainly Protestant, they're operating on the basis of Catholic subsidiarity and furthering the cause. We're the Anti-Federalists. I make this argument in chapters 1 and chapter 2 of Catholic Republic. We're the Anti-Federalists. They were the ones who loved subsidiarity because they said federalism and states' rights, localism, is the best way for the government to be virtuous and for the people to remain virtuous and for you to have truly representative Christian government. In other words, the Anti-Federalists wanted the 13 states to be more like 13 actual states, united in a league of friendship, operating as one whole under the Articles of Confederation, more like under sovereign international immunity principles or treaty government principles. Several of the terms in American political discourse that'll be familiar to you are treaty gov terms. Congress. This is a term like a league of friendship between 13 separate countries. Don't think of them, the original 13 colonies or states, as constituents of one vast nation. Think of them as 13 separate countries that banded together to fight a common foe, tyrant King George III, which is what they did. Congress has always been, since Magna Carta, Congress has always been a term reserved for 13 separate nations fighting a common foe, and that's what it was in America. Federal, FOTUS, this is a treaty government term. Remember the Entmoots, the Entmoot of Treebeard in Lord of the Rings? Well, Tolkien was a linguist. He knew Anglo-Saxon. This idea of moot was a congress. It meant each of those Ents was a separate sovereign. The reason this is relevant is because as it relates to Federalist number 10, the Anti-Federalists who are saying, we don't like this new Constitution, we like the old Constitution, the Articles of Confederation, which allowed subsidiarity, American subsidiarity, to thrive between the years of 1776 and 1788. For those 12 years, until we got the new Constitution ratified, America, the United States of America, had only one capitalized word, states. United and America were not capitalized. It was literally 13 separate countries that were like a league of friendship, but they were sovereign. And as they were sovereign, each of them represented a distinct group, a distinct religious group. The states in the North were Covenantist Puritans and had Covenantist Puritan government. You see how now I'm getting around to answering the big question in the title today? You got to go through the facts, though. Can't just shout something like a post-lib or a classical lib. In the South, they're Episcopalians, Anglicans west of the pond, right? And in Maryland, they very nearly had their own Catholic government, but there's still more Protestants there than Catholics. But this is important because Madison, like anyone that doesn't believe in Catholic pre-liberalism, said, well, we want a monster pluralist continentalism. We want a continental pluralism where we combine all 13 countries into one country in this new 1788 Constitution, which, yes, violates subsidiarity. We'll have one set of laws from the nerve center. That's not exactly how Madison pitched it. In Federalist 10, he said, so what is the biggest evil in a big republic? There had never been a republic as big as what he was pitching, by the way. It was the biggest yet. Republics were always small. They're like little Malta, the biggest England, the Swiss cantons, the little Republic of Venice before it got rolled into Italy. He said, well, what's the main problem? What's the main barrier to having a big republic, which is a contradiction in terms for the subsidiarity reasons I've explained today? He said, well, faction. What did he mean? He meant pluralism. Faction means if you divide the political lines widely enough, then you're going to have all sorts of different people. You're going to have all sorts of different sects of Christian. The sects of Christian should each have their own state. But you won't just have a bunch of different Christians who are arguing, who have different conceptions about alcohol. I live in a place that still has some blue laws, which is ridiculous. It's a better place than California and New York, but we still have some silly Baptist laws. But you'll get even Buddhists, atheists, secular humanists. You'll get Jews, Muslims. Liberalism is pluralism. And Madison, associated with being a classical liberal, but the post-liberals like this as well because they like pluralism. He said, the solution to faction is just have a bunch of factions so all the voices are drowned out. The solution to pluralism, the death knell of a republic, a concept that's opposed to the idea of having a republic, the solution to it is having more pluralism. Well, this is evil. That's Federalist 10. 39 and 51 attempt to say why you don't need all one people. They also attempt to say why the essentially Catholic subsidiarian solution, keep it small to keep it pure to keep it small, are not important. So 1039 and 51, Madison does declare himself to be a classical liberal. But guess what? The post-libs like Sohrab Ahmari and Deneen and Vermeulen and all those guys that claim to hate classical liberals, they love the liberalism that defined the early American classical liberals like James Madison. Continental pluralism. Having a government so large, a continent-sized, almost a hemisphere-sized government, landmass, political culture, that by definition, it's 350 million people. Of course, it's going to be a plural grouping of a bunch of people that can't live together. So you have agreement between the post-libs and the classical libs, like Madison, about the most important-ish grouping principle of a good republic or a good monarchy or a good aristocracy. It's got to be small enough to be univocal, represent one common religion, and it's got to be univocal enough to be small. There's only one worldview that's ever articulated this. It's Roman Catholicism. Now, original America was not a catastrophe for one reason, even after the 1788 Constitution. That reason is because it was based on the 1555 Catholic Holy Roman Empire Peace of Augsburg. The Peace of Augsburg was the Holy Roman Emperor, I believe it was Charles V's, solution to Protestantism. It had the first Diet of Speyer, the second Diet of Speyer, where they were saying, now that we have pockmarked Lutheranism all throughout Western Europe, are the individual territories of Western Europe going to be Lutheran or Catholic, Protestant or Catholic? The first Diet of Speyer said X, second Diet said anti-X, and then they came up with a kind of solution, 1555, Peace of Augsburg. It goes like this: Cuius regio, eos religio. It's in that Latin, and it is Catholic. Cuius regio, eos religio. This is what governed early America. Cuius regio, eos religio. It was the Holy Roman Empire's solution to Lutheranism, and it made a lot of sense. All it meant is whoever's region, their religion. So whether it was a legislature or a prince, whoever the ruling class was, whether it was a republic or a kind of aristocracy, Didn't matter. Whoever ruled it, if they're a Catholic legislator or prince, that will be called a Catholic country, and they will have Catholic laws. If it was a Lutheran legislature or prince, they will have Lutheran laws. There'll be a Lutheran establishment. Roman Catholicism, in other words, came up with this idea, and it's the only solution to Protestantism. The 1054 Great Schism was already geographically divided between Church East and Church West. So when we had the schism between Orthodox and Catholic, it didn't provide any geographical crisis. The Catholic world was already everything west of Cyprus or something. The Orthodox world was everything east of Cyprus or Constantinople or something. No, it was further west than that. So there wasn't some problem. 1517 was a new problem because it was all in the Catholic world. 1517 provided a new crisis that was not provided 500 years before. And the Catholic answer was cuius regio, eius religio. And that's what, even though I don't like Madison's classical liberal reasoning in really any of the Federalist Papers, I always side with the much more Catholic anti-Federalists. Federalist 10, 39, 51 are all answered by Brutus in his 3rd, 4th, and 6th letters. Brutus is one of the anti-Federalists. I am palatable to America from 1788, the new Constitution, through 1791, when the promised Bill of Rights was made good on, where they said, First Amendment, Congress is not allowed to disestablish the state religion. And you probably don't know this unless you've heard it from me. 8 of the 13 states in the United States had an official state religion, and it was all Christian. And the First Amendment was a guarantee of and an expectation of the idea that all 13 of the states would have one official established sect of Christianity. 5 of the states decided not to. That was their choice because they were, again, like their own country. And even Jefferson and Madison, who wrote the First Amendment, were surprised. But the point is, the real First Amendment, which has been subverted in our country now, was cuius regio, eius religio, just like 1555's Peace of Augsburg. It was Catholic. It was essentially the Holy Roman Empire's solution to the Catholic-Protestant split. It all presumed, all of it, 1555, 1791's First Amendment, all presumed that you had a Christian country. Most of the people were Protestant, but these ideas are very Catholic, and there are several Catholics here who are very, very important figures. And it works. It works. So every state should have an official Christian establishment of religion. That means they should have not just God, not the Masonic God on money with the pyramid, but the Christian mentions of Jesus. And each state should have Christian mentions of Jesus that accord with whatever sect of Christianity that state has. Now, the only way you're going to get me and my wife, who love Mississippi, reddest of the 50 states, out of the state is if you ever came up with an established Catholic state. I guess we'd go there. But I mean, being in a Baptist state ain't so bad either. In an established sect, it doesn't mean you can't practice your faith. That was never an expectation, not in 1555, in the Peace of Augsburg, not in 1791 after the First Amendment. Why has this view changed? Well, it's actually because of the early post-liberals. In the 20th century, it was the post-liberals who started working toward subverting the First Amendment. You think the First Amendment means that no state is allowed to have an established Christian sect, meaning its state house, its capital will mention Jesus, or if it's a Catholic state, it would be the Eucharist, Mother Mary, the saints, whatever. The governor should be expected to be of that sect. Maybe he's not, doesn't have to be, but people are all going to expect the governor to be of that sect. Baptist if it's a Baptist state, Catholic if it's a Catholic state, Congregationalist if it's a Congregationalist state. This is the answer. And we had it in early America. Why do you think that the First Amendment means something other than what it means? First Amendment meant explicitly that Congress shall not disestablish Christian establishments of each state. That's up to each state legislature, each of the 50. And it was illegal, as declared by the First Amendment, illegal for Congress to disestablish Christian establishments. This is why the pre-liberal Catholic order, in this case, the Peace of Augsburg, is the solution. Cuius regio, eius religio. Well, the answer why you're all so brainwashed about this, unless you watch this show, and I talk about it once every few months, is because in 1947, there were 7 Freemasons on the High Court. 7 out of 9. That number rose to 8 out of 9 in the early 50s. And they used a case called Everson versus Board of Education to take occasion to literally, with the stroke of a pen, reverse the meaning of the First Amendment and to incorporate the First Amendment, and thereby to say that the First Amendment, which for 150 some years had meant Congress is not allowed to disestablish Christian establishments of each state legislature, change that to mean that state legislatures are not allowed to establish Christian establishments, not allowed to have an official sect of Christianity. That's literally what that case, Everson versus Board of Ed, did. It incorporated the First Amendment against the states. I could do a show on what incorporation doctrine is, but it's all from the 14th Amendment, which comes from the Civil War. By the way, if you like the idea, again, post-liberals like the idea, but they get the premises absolutely wrong. If you like the idea of banning contraception, prawn, abortion, sod marriage, which I do, and which post-liberals claim to, guess where those ideas came from? The idea of making it illegal to ban them, that is. They came from the 14th Amendment, which said we're going to nationalize everything. Under 14th Amendment cases, nationalize everything, eradicate subsidiarity. It became illegal across the board for all of the states to ban contraception. Well, guess what? Until 1965, until a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, all the red states operating under subsidiarity had contraception illegal. Well, in 1965, using 14th Amendment jurisprudence, the High Court made it illegal for the red states to ban contraception. They said, we're going to nationalize everything the way the post-liberals like, but we're going to do the opposite conclusion. We're going to nationalize it such that it's a ban on the ban by even the red right-wing states. 4 years later, in 1969, there was a case called Stanley versus Georgia. In Stanley versus Georgia, they banned the red right-wing states' bans on prawn. In other words, under the idea of post-liberal, nationalize everything, pluralize everything, they made it illegal for those red states to ban prawn. It had always been legal, and most of the states were red. So you get under the heading of post-liberalism, you say make everything the same. One government for the whole continent of America. Well, it became illegal to ban prawn in 1969 under Stanley versus Georgia, just as it had 4 years earlier become illegal to ban contraception for the red states who were already banning contraception. Post-liberalism is a violation of subsidiarity, which is grave evil. Post-liberalism's wrong. Classical liberalism's wrong. 4 years after 1969, in 1973, what do we get? Roe versus Wade. Same 14th Amendment jurisprudence as the previous two cases. It was a ban on the banning of abortion. All the red states already had abortion illegal. as you probably know with regard to that one. You probably didn't know about Griswold or Stanley. But 4 years after that, 14th Amendment jurisprudence, 1973, Roe versus Wade. Let's make it all the same for all 50 states. It's illegal to illegalize abortion, just as 4 years before it became illegal to illegalize prawn. 4 years before that, it became illegal to illegalize contraception. 20 or 25 years after that, Lawrence versus Texas. It becomes illegal, it's more like 30 years after that. It becomes illegal to illegalize SOD in Lawrence versus Texas. Another 14th Amendment case. The red states had it illegal, just the way post-liberals claim to want, except, oh yeah, post-liberals hate subsidiarity, so they cheer for nationalizing, liberalizing, pluralizing everything, one continent size fits all government. And what ended up happening? It becomes illegal to illegalize SOD. And then 10 years after that, you get Obergefell versus Hodges. And whereas the red states had banned, because it's their subsidiarian right to ban sod marriage, they said, no, we need one size fits all for the whole continent, for the whole hemisphere, for the whole globe, if we can get it. Again, the post-liberals are very confused. So now it's illegal to illegalize sod marriage. We're banning the banning of. And this is what I debated with Josh Hammer. And he was very confused. He was like, no, I'm against banning the banning of those. I just like the 14th Amendment, and I hate subsidiarity, and I hate states' rights. It's inarticulate. It's philosophically incoherent. This is what the post-liberals are. They're philosophically incoherent. They say, therefore, good government, which means, yeah, you illegalize bad stuff, some bad stuff at the local level, and you can advocate for good stuff, virtue, at the local level. That's not post-liberalism if you do it at the local level, because at the local level, there's the power to instruct, and it mainly begins at home with the father. But they say, let's do that moral instruction from a nerve center 5,000 miles away. Well, that's globalism. And the classical liberals are no better, really, because even though they claim to like small government, classical liberals like the Federalist Papers. They like Federalist 10. What's the solution? Each of the states was its own country. Some of the states are too big to be their own country. Texas is too big to be a country. Aristotle says you shouldn't be bigger than 50 or 100,000 people, or else you can't have subsidiarity, even though he didn't use the word subsidiarity. Now, I'm going to read for you some quotes here. Leo XIII, Pius XI say it's Catholic teaching. Pius XI articulates that it's actually a natural law moral precept that government has to be small. Non-subsidiarity systems like post-liberalism are all just fractile globalism, hemispheric globalism, continental pluralism, let's say, which violates natural law. Locke and the early classical liberals had an Enlightenment mechanist metaphysics, but lifted our Catholic natural law political economy of subsidiarity, even though they didn't go together, which is why post-libs call people with the correct Catholic view of scope of government classical liberals. That's not what we are. Classical liberal rejects metaphysics. Now, let me read you something else. Here's something good. This is a message from Leo XIII. He writes this: and now, before going any further, we must indicate a craftily circulated calumny making most odious imputations against Catholics, Leo XIII, and even against the Holy See itself. What's this calumny? It is maintained that vigor of action inculcated in Catholics for the defense of their faith has for a secret motive much less the safeguarding of their religious interests than the ambition of securing to the church political domination over the state. He's saying that's not what we're looking for. Now, we should have at local levels little states with Catholic rulers, with Catholic laws at the local levels. But Leo XIII is saying we don't want some vast, sweeping, hemispheric Catholic state, Catholic hegemon. That's not what the church is about. Truly, Leo XIII says, this is the revival of a very ancient calumny, as its invention belongs to the first enemies of Christianity. Post-liberals, put that in your pipe and smoke it. Was it not first of all formulated against the adorable person of the Redeemer? Yes, when he illuminated souls by his preaching and alleviated the corporal or spiritual sufferings of the unfortunate with the treasures of his divine bounty, he was accused of having political ends in view. We have found this man perverting our nation and forbidding to give tribute to Caesar and saying that he is Christ the King. If thou release this man, thou art not Caesar's friend, for whomsoever maketh himself a king speaketh against Caesar. We have no king but Caesar. This is the Pharisees, the so-called Old Testament people of John's gospel. Now, here's so what Leo XIII is saying in Rerum Novarum is not that we shouldn't have local government with Catholic laws by Catholic leaders. He agrees with that. He's saying we shouldn't have hemispheric domination of the state by the church. That's not what the church has ever been about. Jesus specifically denied this is what he was about. He said, render unto Caesar what is Caesar's. Now, so closing principle here, Sohrab Ahmari and the post-liberals will say that they disregard subsidiarity because one of the other four Catholic social teachings rejects subsidiarity, which of course is philosophically incoherent, a contradiction in terms, because the four Catholic social teachings, we don't have to touch the other two. They're more personal, but solidarity and subsidiarity are two of the four. They have to go together. But Sohrab says, well, I'm allowed, he's tweeted this many times, I'm allowed to disregard subsidiarity, even though disregarding it is a grave offense, a mortal sin, because of solidarity. And then he proceeds to, I forget if the weird definition comes out of Populorum et Progressio or something. Paul VI or John the 23rd gave a weird definition of solidarity early on. But listen to what John Paul II says about solidarity in a document called Centesimus Annus, 100 years after Rerum Novarum. In this way, we nowadays call the principle of solidarity the validity of which both in the internal order of each nation and in the international order I've discussed in the encyclical Solicitudo Rei Socialis is clearly seen to be one of the fundamental principles of the Christian view of social and political organization. So JP2 just said there, solidarity is one of the four Catholic social principles. It goes with subsidiarity. So right away, if it goes with subsidiarity, the principle that it's a grave evil for a faraway government to occupy the competency of the legislative power, to occupy the legislative field of a more local authority, then we know it can't contradict it. Some people following Paul VI say that solidarity contradicts subsidiarity. Sohrab Ahmari is one of them. We'll listen to this next sentence by John Paul II. This principle of subsidiarity is frequently stated by Pope Leo XIII, the one who laid out Rerum Novarum 100 years before. We know Leo XIII loves subsidiarity, even though the term wouldn't be named for 40 years later. Its definition is given in Rerum by Leo. Leo XIII, who uses the term friendship, a concept already found in Greek philosophy. This is a big deal. The idea of defining solidarity as friendship or amity, because it's close. It's called It's called similitude to the concept of Aristotelian concord. Now, this is most important as a closing idea because when you look at Catholic social teaching and you say, okay, subsidiarity, this means essentially federalism, localism, small government, you can have, it's not libertarianism because you legislate morality at the local level. Whatever a father isn't capable of doing, and he's capable of doing most legislation for his household, he's not capable of doing it all. So the political organization matters. Most of this should be at the city level. Because remember, for Aristotle and Thomas, your real political community is your city. It shouldn't be larger than 50,000. Well, the people, post-libs, who hate this, and even classical libs like Madison, who hated the idea of keeping your country small the way Catholic teaching requires you to, they would say, well, solidarity. According to Paul VI, I didn't even find it for today's show, he gave a kind of wacky definition. Solidarity pushes back against subsidiarity. It makes the government more far off. That's just not true. John Paul II here gives the answer that must be given to what is solidarity. It must be Aristotelian concord. And concord means friendship. That means there must be friendship, a natural political alliance between citizens of a republic. If it's going to be subsidiarian, if I'm going to live in a neighborhood of my friends, let's say we buy all the houses. We're going to have a Eucharistic procession on the first Friday of every month. And we're going to, observe Christian sobriety laws or something in this little neighborhood polis, this little neighborhood political organization. It's not immoral. It's not a grave evil because this is our little country. It's small enough to be pure. It's pure enough to be small. Well, solidarity, that second principle, simply means concord. Or as John Paul II says in Centesimus Annus, it means friendship. It means if you want to keep government small and local, then the citizens have to be the same as in friends, as in Aristotle. Aristotle describes in Book 2 of the Politics and Book 3 of the Politics. The citizenry should all look alike in order to have concord. They should all worship alike in order to have concord. They must value all the same things in order to have concord. So subsidiarity and solidarity go together. They do not push against each other. This is the answer to all the solutions. The Catholic teaching is pre-liberal, pre-classical liberal. Concord means if you're going to keep the club small, you're going to keep it pure by having a natural friendship between all the people. To keep the natural friendship has to be subsidiarian. To keep it subsidiarian, the people all have to pretty much automatically agree with each other about most important things. Imagine a neighborhood of you and your best, most Catholic friends who agree about most everything. That's a res publica. Of course, solidarity can't contradict subsidiarity, but it's been misdefined by one of those popes, I forget who, Paul VI or John the 23rd, who were accused of being communist. So probably Paul VI. And misapplied by dishonest post-liberals like Sohrab Ahmari, such as to say, well, there's something that contradicts subsidiarity and solidarity. No, it's the perfect corollary to solidarity, to subsidiarity. They go together like a wink and a nod. And if you disbelieve any of this, just consult an older Pope, Pius IX's relationship with the Italian unification, Risorgimento, liberals, pluralists. Mazzini and Garibaldi were Freemasons who wanted to unify Italy. Does this sound familiar? Does this sound like Lincoln? Pius IX said he himself was a prisoner in the Vatican because Mazzini and Garibaldi marched on the Vatican and forced him into the larger political organization, hated the subsidiarity of the Vatican being its own state. And guess what? Garibaldi was friends with Abe Lincoln. This was going on at almost the exact same time, 2 years apart in the 1850s and 60s. And Abe Lincoln tried to get Garibaldi to destroy subsidiarity in America. Garibaldi was a general. He tried to conscript him as the commander of the North, as Garibaldi had just done to Pius IX in Italy. This is why Pius IX liked Jefferson Davis and the Confederacy so much. Had nothing to do with slavery, had to do with subsidiarity. Keep a country small, had to do with solidarity. You're not told any of this. This is why, if you keep your country small, you keep it pure. If you keep it pure, you can keep it small. This is why, yes, leaders should be Christian in a Christian nation, but the nation should be much smaller than the post-liberals or the classical liberals are willing to tell you. It's a lot today. But these discourses are had in picture-thinking ways without all the distinctions. And of course, I have to correct that. It's early in 2024, a general election year. Is this going to happen in America? No, of course not. But we can pray. We can say God wills it. Deus Vult. We want a returned, healthy, restored Catholic view of politics. We get Catholic leaders in small spaces. And if it's a Baptist state like Mississippi, then I guess they're going to get Baptist leaders under the principle of cuius regio, eius religio. This is the Catholic way. It was the Catholic solution in 1555. It was essentially an ideologically Catholic solution in 1791, and we went away from it because of continental pluralism. Liberalism. Continental pluralism is liberalism, and it's been embraced by both the enemies, the post-libs and the classical libs alike. I've given you the solution to it today. I hope you spread the word, evangelize that, because many people don't know. Deus Vult.